Prussian obedience is that of a free decision, not that of a submissive willingness to serve. I am deliberately placing this reflection under this statement, because at least 8 field marshals of the Second World War from the former Prussian army saw this statement every day before the First World War, as members of the main cadet institute in Berlin, Lichterfelde, where the inscription was displayed in the dining hall. Werner von Blomberg, Walter von Brauchitsch, Gerd von Rundstedt, Fedor von Bock, Günther von Kluge, Erwin von Witzleben, Erich von Manstein, and Ernst Busch. But when they were repeatedly faced with the choice of making a free decision before and during the Second World War, or a submissive willingness to serve, some of them chose to practice submissive willingness to serve towards a military dilettante. The other men who were appointed field marshals came from the Prussian army that existed until 1918. Wilhelm Keidel, Walter von Reichenau, Georg von Küchler, Friedrich Paulus, Ewald von Kleist, and Walter Model. Erwin Rommel came from the Royal Württemberg Army, and the remaining 4 from the Royal Bavarian Army: Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, Wilhelm List, Maximilian von und zu Weix, and Ferdinand Schörner. Of these 19 army field marshals, 9 came from the infantry, 9 from the artillery, and 1 from the cavalry. Of them, 1 was killed in action, 1 was executed after the war, 3 committed suicide, and 14 died, some in Allied custody or in Soviet captivity. And only 1 of them had the insight and the courage for active resistance, and was executed for that after the 20th of July, 1944. It is not easy to report on the last field marshals of the German army, because at the end of their service, their homeland was devastated, and more than 6 million of their soldiers were dead. That is on a scale as if the major cities of Berlin, Hamburg, and Frankfurt had ceased to exist. Now, you can read about their military achievements in many international books, some of which are even taught at military academies around the world. But on the other hand, there was also the cooperation of some of them, or at least their turning a blind eye within their area of command, when the so-called Einsatz units were rampaging, without them putting an end to it, even if necessary by using force. Excusing explanations by the surviving field marshals after the war, claiming they knew nothing about all of this, are hardly believable, since many of their soldiers had written home about the horrific experiences in their letters. Of course, there were also field marshals who, according to their rank and their responsibility for the soldiers entrusted to them, openly criticized Hitler's conduct of the war. But that was mainly limited to the military aspect. Criticism of the dictator's political decisions was almost never heard, or only when the end was already in sight. One reason for this, sometimes almost submissive obedience of the highest representatives of the German army toward Hitler, was that people do not judge their lives impartially. But this submissiveness also resulted from the fact that they allowed themselves to be bribed with the highest honors, and in some cases with estates and large sums of money. But this also created a dependence on politics that was unheard of for an active officer. In contrast, their soldiers, who repeatedly had to risk their lives, faced the overwhelming personnel and material superiority of 48 countries, and had to bury more and more fallen comrades in one of the thousands of cemeteries established everywhere. They had long realized that this war could only end in disaster. But their highest-ranking generals did not dare to put an end to it in time. It is telling that only one field marshal, Erwin von Witzleben, can be found in the active part of the military resistance, and that has been the case since the September conspiracy of 1938. I will come back to that. But I want to point out right now that, Given the complexity and the different personalities, it is impossible to describe the lives of the protagonists in detail. Therefore, in this critical review, I will limit myself to their actions during World War II, in which, except for one of them, all the others were promoted to Field Marshal. So, who were these officers who were given the highest military rank between 1936 and 1945? The first one on April 20th, 1936, still during peacetime, the first to be promoted to Field Marshal was Colonel General Werner von Blomberg, born in 1878 in Pomerania and coming from the infantry, who served as Reichswehr minister from 1933 to 1938, and from 1935 onwards as Reich Minister of War. Blomberg was a compliant, vain character who even powdered his cheeks red. He was also the one who, after the death of Reich President Hindenburg, on the 2nd of August 1934, had arranged for the Reichswehr to swear a personal oath to Hitler from then on. After his appointment as Field Marshal here during Mussolini's visit to Berlin, the active officer von Blomberg accepted the Golden Party badge of the National Socialist German Workers' Party on the 30th of January 1937 and became a party member. However, von Blomberg, together with the chief of the army command, Colonel General von Fritsch, was also too much of a trained soldier to follow Hitler into war without hesitation. With Fritsch, seen here on the left in the picture, he had become one of the most important military critics of Hitler's aggressive, conflict-prone foreign policy. But with that, both of them ended up on the hit list of the Nazi system, while their fellow generals, however, kept their heads down so as not to ruin their own careers. In Blomberg's dismissal, chance played the decisive role, if it really was chance. Because, since 1932, the widower had a rather odd passion for a Reich Minister of War. He liked to go out at night, and his favorite place to visit was the Berlin bar The White Stag, where the 24-year-old blonde and attractive Louise Margarete Grün worked. The lively woman had a series of suggestive photos taken of herself, which her 41-year-old Czech boyfriend, Heinrich Löwinger, had sold under the table at Berlin train stations for 80 pfennigs each, until he was caught by the Vice Squad. But that also meant that Louise Margarete, residing at 118 Eisenacher Street in Berlin, had become known to the authorities. But in the meantime, she had so thoroughly turned the older field marshal's head that he even got her a job as a secretary at the National Egg Office. Then she claimed to him that she was pregnant and wanted to get married. But since her past life was in sharp contrast to the strict code of conduct of the German officer corps, the older gentleman also didn't want to appear just as a Casanova. In short, Mr. von Blomberg took the risk and married Miss Grün with the two most important men of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring, as witnesses and hosts at the table. The rest is quickly told. After a detective recognized Louisa Margarete Grün, now von Blomberg, in one of the incriminating photos, they ended up, through various channels, with the power-hungry Hermann Göring, who now saw his chance for military advancement and demanded that von Blomberg either annul the marriage or resign. The field marshal chose the second demand, and on the 27th January 1938, and resigned for health reasons and then came to terms with it. He retired to Bad Wiese with his young wife and 50,000 Reichsmarks, and did not appear in any military capacity again. Nevertheless, after the war he was arrested by the Allies and was already seriously ill. On the 14th March 1946, he died of cancer in an American military hospital in Nuremberg at the age of 67. Both of his sons had fallen. Henning von Blomberg, born in 1905 in North Africa, became a major and commander of the tank battalion on the 22nd November 1942. Axel von Blomberg, born in 1908 in Baghdad, on the 12th May 1941 as a major in the Air Force. Actually, with the resignation of Blomberg, the most respected and esteemed officer of the Wehrmacht would have become the new Reichswehr minister. The commander-in-chief of the army, Colonel General Werner Freiherr von Fritsch. But it's hardly believable. During his farewell visit with Hitler, von Blomberg did not suggest his comrade von Fritsch as his successor, but rather Hitler himself. And things happened just as the Nazi leadership had planned. Hardly had von Blomberg fallen when on February 3, 1938, the even more dangerous for the system, Baron von Fritsch, was also forced to resign with baseless accusations of homosexuality. Then Hitler immediately incorporated the Ministry of War into the newly created High Command of the Armed Forces. He made General of Artillery Wilhelm Keitel, who was also called Lack Keitel because of his unquestioning obedience to Hitler, his chief, and on the 4th of February 1938, he assumed supreme command of the armed forces. The compliant General of Artillery, Walter von Brauchitsch, whom I'll discuss shortly, had become Army Commander-in-Chief. In those days, the German generals humbly accepted the sacrifice of the traditional command structure when on the 18th August 1938, the Chief of the General Staff, the highly respected General of Artillery Ludwig Beck, another determined opponent of Hitler's course of war and a later victim of the 20th, resigned on July 20th, 1944 with the honorary rank of Colonel General. There was no longer any serious opponent standing in Hitler's way to enforce his political goals, even through war. In April 1939, a major reorganization of the political and military leadership began. On this occasion, 16 senior generals were retired at once and 44 others were transferred. This also made it clear to those who were allowed to stay that any opposition could result in early retirement. The second person promoted to General Feldmarschall was, on July 19, 1944, the 1933 appointed as the successor to the dismissed Colonel General Werner von Fritsch, and already mentioned, born in Berlin in 1881 and coming from the artillery, Walter von Brauchitsch. He had been more of a compromise candidate than one of conviction for this outstanding position, but he was also chosen because Hitler had nothing to fear from him. Brauchitsch, rather unstable and susceptible to corruption, proved to be a willing tool of Hitler's policies. His backbone was completely broken when, at the age of 57, in the middle of the Sudeten crisis in September 1938, after 28 years of marriage, he left his wife for his 36-year-old lover, Charlotte Rofer, seen on the far right in the picture, and received 80,000 marks from Hitler's special fund as a settlement for his first wife. Over time, Brauchitsch became increasingly dependent on financial assistance from Hitler. His involvement in the early resistance is based on rumors in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa. When the attack on Moscow came to a halt in December, Brauchitsch recommended pulling the army back and switching to the defensive for the winter. But as Colonel General Franz Halder, who served as Chief of the Army General Staff from September 1938 to September 1942, pictured on the left, later reported, here, together with von Brauchitsch, Hitler had fiercely resisted the idea of retreating to a winter position with fanatical rage. He ordered the troops to fight to the last man, even in hopeless situations wherever they were. After von Brauchitsch suffered a heart attack in November 1941, he was dismissed on the 19th of December. After the war, in August 1945, he was arrested by the British Army and imprisoned at the Island Farm prisoner of war camp. And then, on the 8th of August 1946, he was summoned as a witness at the Nuremberg trials. However, by then he was almost completely blind. Before the opening of a trial against him on the 18th of October, 1948, he died of heart failure at the age of 67 in British military custody in Hamburg. Briefly, Brauchitsch resigned on December 19, 1941. After that, Hitler made himself the commander-in-chief of the army, thereby finally eliminating the independence of the army and cementing the one-man dictatorship. All the powers of the head of state, the minister of war, the supreme commander of the armed forces, and the commander-in-chief of the army were now concentrated in the hands of one man, to whom every soldier in the army, air force, and navy was bound by an unconditional personal oath of loyalty. And after Hitler demanded from the Reichstag, which was filled with puppets, the function of supreme judge, he then also possessed absolute power over punishment and dismissal. Also, on July 19th, 1940, Wilhelm Keitel, who came from the artillery and was born in 1882 in Helmscherode, Lower Saxony, was promoted to Field Marshal. He was, as I have already mentioned, the chief of the High Command of the Wehrmacht from 1938 to 1945. He was, besides the chief of the Air Force, Hermann Göring, the only one among the military leadership who was sentenced to death and actually executed at the Nuremberg trials. And Wilhelm Keitel was an early and clear sympathizer of National Socialism, joined the Nazi Party in 1939, and, together with von Blomberg, pinned the Golden Party badge to his uniform. Keitel, on the far right, was primarily an executor of Hitler's military leadership. In 1942, he rewarded himself with 250,000 Reichsmarks and a large forest estate worth almost 747,000 Reichsmarks. After the French campaign, he told Hitler, "My Führer, you are the greatest military commander of all time." However, after the Stalingrad disaster, this led to the derisive term Großphase. On the 15th July 1941, his son Hans Georg, a lieutenant in Artillery Regiment 29, was killed in action. To save his own skin after the increasing defeats, Keitel often shifted the blame onto others, including the one on the 16th of October 1946, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, who was executed by him. During the catastrophe, Keitel urged obedience until the end, on the night of the 8th to 9th of May 1945, and he signed the unconditional surrender of the German armed forces in Berlin-Karlshorst. Later, at the Nuremberg trials, he was especially incriminated by the orders he had issued from 1941 onwards, such as the Commissar Order, or the so-called Reprisal Order. It had demanded that for every German soldier killed from an ambush, 50 to 100 civilians be executed. As with many of the co-defendants, the so-called main war criminals, his sentence was also death by hanging. His request to be shot as a soldier had been denied. Keitel, age 64, was executed on the 16th October 1946 by 39-year-old United States Army hangman Master Sergeant John C. Woods. He lasted 24 minutes. Another officer who got promoted on the 19th July 1940 was Gerd von Rundstedt, born in 1875 in Oschersleben, Prussian province of Saxony. He came from the infantry. In 1938, at the age of 63, he retired as Colonel General at his own request, but was repeatedly reactivated in 1939 and commanded various army groups in both the West and the East during the war. In 1942, here with General Rommel, he was the Commander-in-Chief West in France, where on the 6th of June, 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy took place. Although he too was a critic of Hitler's rigid command style, von Rundstedt, as the oldest of the field marshals in 1944, also did not dare to oppose him. In the extremely critical situation for the Normandy troops, he did not dare to release the tank divisions that were under the so-called Führer's Reserve. When afterwards, in a phone call, Field Marshal Keitel loudly demanded, quote, "End the war, you idiots," he was replaced by Field Marshal von Klug on the 2nd of July. But then, in September 1944, von Rundstedt was once again appointed as Commander-in-Chief West, this time until his final dismissal in March 1945. When Hitler, in December 1944, pushed through the reckless Ardennes offensive against von Rundstedt's explicit criticism, von Rundstedt did not even attend the final briefing at first, but then, despite knowing better, still led the operation, which failed after a few weeks. After the surrender, the already 71-year-old von Rundstedt was imprisoned and charged in Great Britain. He testified as a defense witness at the 1946 Nuremberg trials. He was then released in May 1949, and after his death at the age of 77 on the 24th of February 1953, he was buried in Hanover. Another one of the new men promoted to Field Marshal on July 19th. 1940 was Fedor von Bock. The apolitical officer, born in 1880 in Küstrin and coming from the infantry, was never close to National Socialism. Von Bock was considered a brilliant military leader and, in 1941, as commander of Army Group Center, repeatedly spoke out energetically against orders he found unacceptable, such as the so-called Commissar Order. But he, too, was unable to bring himself to offer strong resistance. In December 1941, during the Battle of Moscow, after which Operation Barbarossa and the German Blitzkrieg strategy against the Soviet Union had ultimately failed, he was dismissed by Hitler due to initiating retreat movements. In January 1942, after Field Marshal von Rathenau's death, he succeeded him as Commander-in-Chief of Army Group South. In this position, there were repeated heated arguments with Hitler, as a result of which Fedor von Bock was finally relieved of his duties on the 15th of July, 1942. A few days before the war ended, on the 3rd of May 1945, the 64-year-old von Bock, his driver, his second wife Wilhelmina, and the youngest stepdaughter Catherine von der Osten were killed in their car near Lenzon in Schleswig-Holstein during a British fighter-bomber attack on their vehicle. Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, who also came from the Bavarian artillery and was born in 1876 in Landsberg am Lech, was promoted to General Field Marshal on July 19, 1940. This conservative Catholic was opposed to the Nazi regime from the very beginning. In a diary entry from September 1939, after the declarations of war by France and England, there is the sentence, "A deluded fool, a criminal." But he also did not draw any direct consequences from this. Instead, during World War II, he led various army groups such as Army Group C, which was responsible for breaking through the Maginot Line during the campaign in France. During the war against the Soviet Union, he is on the right in the picture, serving as the commander of Army Group North near Leningrad. But when von Leeb demanded a retreat to a more strategically favorable position, which led to a serious conflict with Hitler, he was asked to be relieved of command on the 16th of January 1942, and was no longer employed. But even Ritter von Leeb had been a beneficiary of Hitler's bribery program and had accepted 41 secret payments and gifts totaling 888,000 Reichsmarks at the taxpayer's expense. He was then sentenced to 3 years in prison in the Nuremberg follow-up trial in 1948, even though no culpable behavior could be proven against him. His son Alfred was killed in action during the Polish campaign in September 1939 as a lieutenant in the Mountain Infantry Regiment 99. He died on the 29th of April 1956 as a result of a stroke at the age of 79 in Füssen. In the 19th century, during the mass promotions from Colonel General to Field Marshal that took place on July 1940, Wilhelm List, who was born in 1880 in Oberkirchen, near Ulm, in the Kingdom of Württemberg, and came from the Bavarian infantry, was also promoted. He, too, had never been particularly close to the Nazi system and had not hidden this from Hitler. In the Second World War, starting in 1941, he was a commander in southeastern Europe, where he was responsible for so-called hostage shootings that went far beyond the laws of war and also affected uninvolved civilians. In July 1942, he was appointed commander of Army Group A, seen on the right in the picture, which led the main advance toward the Caucasus and Baku. But already on the 10th in September, List was relieved of his command after strong disagreements over Hitler's operational leadership and was no longer employed. After the war, in the so-called trial against generals in Southeast Europe, List was accused of excessive reprisals against the civilian population. He got sentenced to life imprisonment, but was released early in 1952 due to his poor health. He died on the 16th of August, 1971, at the age of 91 in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Another one was Günther von Kluge, born in 1882 in Posen. He came from the artillery and was appointed field marshal on the 19th in July 1940. He first served as an army commander in World War II, and from December 1941 led Army Group Center. On his 60th birthday, he accepted over 250,000 Reichsmarks from Hitler's secret fund. When in 1943 he learned about the murder of up to 1,500 Jews in his area of command, he explained to his adjutant Eberhard von Breitenbuch that he did nothing out of fear of being dismissed. After the Allied invasion on July 6, 1944 in Normandy, he had been Commander-in-Chief West since the 7th July, 1944, and on the 17th July, he also became Commander-in-Chief of Army Group B. But when his units were increasingly decimated by superior Allied air forces in August, and when he had been unreachable for a few hours, the now suspicious Hitler had replaced him with the General-Colonel model. Kluge then praised Hitler effusively in his farewell and declaration of loyalty letter, and then urged him to end the war. Then, although he was not an active participant in the group of conspirators of the 20th of July, at 61 years old, he took his own life on the 19th in August 1944. He was then buried with military honors in Böhne, Brandenburg, which is now a district of Reichenau. However, today his grave is empty, because the coffin was stolen by unknown persons after the end of the war. The next one who got promoted to Field Marshal on the 19th July 1940 was born in Breslau, Silesia. He also came from the infantry. His name was Erben von Witzleben, who should be considered in more detail because of his uniqueness among the field marshals. He was promoted to General of the Infantry on October 1st, 1936, then became Commanding General of the Berlin Third Army Corps. At the beginning of September 1938, he made himself available in this role as a military executive organ to the resistance group around the Chief of Military Intelligence, Abwehr, Hans Oster, the Artillery General Ludwig Beck, and the opposition politician of the German National Front People's Party, Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, for the coup d'état planned during the so-called Sudeten crisis in September 1938. However, Witzleben has always rejected killing Hitler for Christian reasons. Instead, after forcing Hitler to resign, his third unit, which had been put on alert, was supposed to occupy Berlin, suppress any resistance from the SS, after which a new government would be proclaimed. However, on the 30th, the agreement signed in Munich on September 30th, 1938, between Great Britain, France, Italy, and Germany regarding the cession of the Sudetenland to the German Reich prevented this coup from happening. Serious historians are convinced that, as the best prepared, he would also have had the greatest chances of restoring lawful conditions. However, Erben von Witzleben was probably not unhappy about the changes after the 30th either. January, when the elderly Reich President von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor. However, this approval had dramatically decreased after the SS, on Hitler's orders, on the 30th in June 1934 during the Röhm Putsch. Along with numerous Sturmabteilung members, the SS had also murdered, since 1932, the Deputy Reichswehr Minister Major General Ferdinand von Bredow, and the last chancellor before Hitler, Major General Kurt von Schleicher, together with his wife. After that, there should really have been only one response from the Reichswehr: the ruthless use of armed force to restore the rule of law in Germany. Large parts of the population had been waiting for this intervention on June 30th, 1934. However, the Reichswehr leadership had submitted to Hitler, even praising the murders as politically necessary for the state. But by doing so, they had finally broken away from the traditions and concepts of honor of the past and delivered themselves to Hitler, for better or worse. Back to the year 1938. After the planned coup in September did not take place due to Hitler's success, Erben von Witzleben first led the First Army against France in World War II, and then in 1941 became Commander-in-Chief West. But already in March 1942, at the age of 61, he was transferred to the reserve because he was suspected of being part of the military opposition and was therefore no longer wanted for use. However, the group around Colonel von Stauffenberg had intended for him, after a successful coup on the 20th July 1944, to be the commander-in-chief of the entire Wehrmacht. The nearly 63-year-old von Witzleben, who, on the 20th of July, had stayed in the Bendler block, was arrested on the 21st of July, and on the 8th of August was hanged in Berlin-Plötzensee in a particularly cruel manner. What preceded was an extremely vulgar behavior, completely lacking in decency, before the Reich court under the truly dreadful jurist Roland Freisler. Exactly the opposite of Witzleben was another man, who on the 19th July 1940 had been appointed Field Marshal, Walter von Reichenau, born in 1884 in Karlsruhe, and coming from the artillery. He had practically been the party general of the German army, who, more than anyone else, together with the Reich Minister of War von Blomberg, was responsible for aligning the army with National Socialism. It was Reichenau who, in July, together with Hermann Göring and the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, had drawn up the list of Sturmabteilung leaders to be murdered. And together with Blomberg, as I mentioned, he introduced the personal oath of allegiance of the Reichswehr to Hitler in August 1934, and enforced the display of the Nazi party symbol, the swastika, on the uniform. It is true that von Reichenau, for military reasons, had repeatedly spoken out against the Western campaign and also the attack on the Soviet Union before the war began. But he still led the Sixth Army against France. And it is true that he had protested against the crimes committed by the SS in Poland. But that was all he did. Instead, during the war against the Soviet Union, he explicitly advocated for what he called an ideological war against Bolsheviks and Jews. And he was also jointly responsible for mass executions in his rear command area. On January 14th, 1942, on the Eastern Front, during a run through the woods at minus 40 degrees Celsius, the 57-year-old von Reichenau suffered a severe stroke, from which he died on the 17th of January while being flown to the hospital. In 1944, his family was granted property by Hitler worth 1.01 million Reichsmarks, which is over 6.5 million euros in today's value. The leading marshal was the one who was promoted to Field Marshal on the 22nd June 1942, and who was born in Heidenheim an der Brenz in the Kingdom of Württemberg in 1881, Erwin Rommel. In the France campaign of 1940, the major general who came from the Württemberg infantry successfully led the 7th Panzer Division and had attracted positive attention in Berlin for his leadership from the front and by example. He had another after the 1st of January 1941, after being promoted to lieutenant general, taken over the so-called Speerverband Africa in North Africa, the later Panzer Army Africa. Promoted to general of the armored troops in July 1941, he managed to achieve some spectacular victories against the Commonwealth troops in Africa until 1942, despite being constantly outnumbered. But after the necessary supplies failed to arrive for various reasons, the German Italian Africa Army had, on the 12th of May, 1943, forced to surrender. Rommel had been flown out earlier and later took command of Army Group B, which was responsible in the event that Italy defected as an ally. But the rapid rise of the Desert Fox, as Rommel was popularly called, and the propaganda he cultivated had not only earned him friends. In fact, many fellow generals did not speak very well of the, quote, self-important upstart without general staff training, who had nevertheless been entrusted with commands over large formations in exposed theaters of war. From the end of 1943, Rommel's Army Group B was transferred to France and was thus also responsible for defending against the expected Allied invasion in France. When this happened on the 6th of June, 1944, after the Normandy landing, Rommel had failed to convince von Rundstedt's Western Command to grant release the tank divisions shown in pink. However, it is questionable whether these could have made any difference given the overwhelming air superiority of the Allies, especially since, except for one, the other tank divisions were already relatively worn out from previous deployments. After the Allies managed to establish a larger bridgehead in Normandy, thanks to their air superiority of 20-1, which they kept reinforcing with new divisions, Rommel, who had been at the invasion front from the very first day, realized that the war in the West could no longer be won. In a personal conversation with Hitler, and just like Field Marshal von Kluge before his suicide, he too had now, in a letter to Hitler on the 15th July, 1944, issued demands. The troops are fighting heroically everywhere, but the uneven battle is coming to an end. In my opinion, it is necessary to draw conclusions from this situation. Rommel's clear insights were also one of the reasons why the conspirators of the 20th of July had hoped for his active participation in the coup attempt. But on the 17th of June, all hopes were shattered when the field marshal was seriously wounded in a low-flying attack at home in Württemberg's Herrlingen. During his convalescence, the 52-year-old Rommel was visited by Generals Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Meisel on the 14th of October, 1944. They confronted him with allegedly incriminating material about the 20th of July and, after threatening his family, forced him to commit suicide. When it comes to Rommel's role in the military resistance, there are many statements both for and against. However, as early as the summer of 1945, his widow Lucia Maria Rommel, then 54, was here with her son, Manfred, who would later become the mayor of Stuttgart and the retired Luftwaffe field marshal. Albert Kesselring publicly stated that her husband was involved neither in the preparation nor in the execution of the 20th of June, and had always rejected an assassination attempt on Hitler. A week after Rommel's promotion to Marshal, on the 30th of June 1942, Georg von Küchler, who was born in 1881 at Philipsruhe Castle near Hanau, and was a former Grand Ducal Hessian field artilleryman, was appointed field marshal. At the beginning of the war, Küchler was initially commander-in-chief of an army, then from 1942 to 1944 commander-in-chief of Army Group North. Küchler had also spoken of the ideological war, supported the order for the immediate liquidation of Soviet commissars, and also condoned unlawful actions against civilians in his rear command area. After a disagreement with Hitler, he was relieved of his command on the 29th of January 1944, and was not used again until the end of the war. After the war, his involvement in the German military history section established by the Americans did not protect him from prosecution in the Nuremberg follow-up trials, in which, on the 27th October 1948, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for various reasons. but he had already been released on parole in 1953 for health reasons, and on the 25th May 1968, at the age of 86, he passed away in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. The most talented one was undoubtedly the one appointed to Field Marshal on the 30th of June 1942, Erich von Manstein. The officer, born in Berlin in 1887 and coming from the infantry, had already demonstrated his operational talent in the First World War. Manstein had served in the Reichswehr, in the Secret General Staff, and then in the early Wehrmacht as Chief of Staff of the important Third Army Corps in Berlin. He had rejected the so-called Aryan paragraphs, which were extended to the Wehrmacht by War Minister Blomberg with a memorandum, but after that he refrained from further political criticism. But that did not mean that Manstein was a convinced National Socialist. Probably not. Before the France campaign in 1940, he had presented the idea of the sickle cut, which, when it was put into practice in May, was partly responsible for the rapid defeat of France. In the war against the Soviet Union, in which his son Gero died as a lieutenant in the 1st Battalion of the Grenadier Regiment Mott 51 in action on the 29th October 1942 at the age 19, Manstein had achieved several remarkable successes. These were also made possible by the fact that he had, in part, operated against the orders of the Army High Command, that is, against Hitler. But even he made statements against the so-called Jewish Bolshevik system. Furthermore, he also did nothing to stop the murder operations carried out by special units in his area of command. When, in February 1943, after the destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, his relationship with Hitler had cooled significantly, there were attempts by the military resistance to involve him as a figurehead in a coup d'etat, thwarted by his statement that Prussian field marshals do not mutiny. In the spring of 1943 on the Eastern Front, when the collapse of the entire Southern Front was imminent, and again in early January 1944, Manstein once again achieved operational masterpieces. But then, after increasingly numerous and harsh confrontations with Hitler, who repeatedly intervened down to the battalion level from 2,000 kilometers away using situation maps, Manstein's credit was also exhausted. On March 30th, 1944, he was finally transferred to the Führer Reserve. After the war, interned by the British for 4 years, Manstein was initially only questioned as a witness in the Nuremberg trial against the main war leaders. Then, however, he was tried by a British court. In the last war crimes trial, from the 23rd August to the 19th of December 1949, among other things, for tolerated executions of prisoners of war, and for handing over Soviet political commissars to the security service, he was sentenced to 18 years in Werl prison. Before the trial, numerous political commissars and prominent figures donated money for his defense. Among them was former Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In May 1952, again with the support of Winston Churchill, Erich von Manstein was granted parole. He then served as an unofficial advisor to the Bundeswehr until 1960, which, after his death at the age of 85 on the 10th of June 1973 in Irschenhausen, honored him. The Chief of Staff of the Bundeswehr, Admiral Armin Zimmermann, delivered the eulogy. Perhaps the most tragic figure was Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, among other things also during the Battle of Stalingrad. The level-headed one, more of a desk officer than a frontline leader, had, in 1942, despite his lack of experience in commanding large units, taken command of the 6th, considered an elite formation. He was also tasked with capturing Stalingrad. When the army was facing a military, and especially a human, catastrophe, Paulus did not surrender, despite the advice of numerous generals in his army who had repeatedly reminded him of his position as army commander, and, above all, his responsibility toward the soldiers. Instead, he followed Hitler's order to hold out until the end. When the army was then encircled and no longer able to break out, Hitler promoted him on the 31st of January 1943 via radio to Field Marshal, thereby indirectly urging him to commit suicide. Paulus only surrendered when the Sixth Army was completely incapable of fighting. For most of the 235,000 German, Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian soldiers taken prisoner, this meant death. In captivity in his own dacha, he went from being an obedient executor of Hitler's orders to becoming one of his outspoken critics. He had also joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, which was established in Moscow by the Politburo of the Communist Party of Germany. At the Nuremberg trials, he was only questioned as a witness for the Soviet Union because of his now compliant attitude toward the Soviets. There, he testified exactly as they wanted and shifted the blame for everything that happened onto others. In 1953, Friedrich Paulus was released to East Germany, where he died on February 1, 1957, at the age of 66 in Dresden, and was buried with military honors. His son Friedrich, born in 1918, was a captain near Ponteroto, and got killed during the defense against the Allied invasion at Anzio in Italy on the 29th of February 1944. On the 1st of February 1943, Ewald von Kleist, who was born in 1881 in Braunfels an der Lahn and came from the artillery, was promoted to Field Marshal. He had retired in 1938, but was reactivated at the beginning of the war and had commanded an armored corps, later the armored group named after him. In 1942, he too accepted endowments from Hitler, real estate worth 567,000 Reichsmarks. In November of that year, von Kleist was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Army Group A, but after several disputes with Hitler, he was dismissed in March 1944 and was not employed again after that. In 1946, initially imprisoned by Great Britain, Kleist was then extradited to Yugoslavia, where he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Then, in 1948, he was extradited to the Soviet Union, where he was sentenced to life imprisonment in Moscow. On the 13th or 16th in November, 1954, von Kleist died at the age of 73 in the central prison of the city of Vladimir, located 190 kilometers east of Moscow. In the prison were the last battle commander of Berlin, General of the Artillery, Helmut Weidling, also died on the 17th of November, 1955. Maximilian von Wakes was born on November 12, 1881 in Dessau, and came from the Royal Bavarian Cavalry. He too was promoted on the 1st of February 1943 to the rank of Field Marshal. After the 1939 Polish campaign, he became Second Commander-in-Chief Army, and during the German offensive in August 1942 in southern Russia, he was appointed Commander of Army Group B. After he was transferred to the reserve in July 1943, here are his insignia in an American museum, he was reactivated a month later and then commanded Army Group F in the Balkans, until he was finally transferred to the reserve in March 1945 and, a little later, was taken prisoner by the Americans in Bavaria. In May 1947 in Nuremberg, during the aforementioned general's trial in Southeast Europe, he was released from custody for health reasons. Maximilian von Wakes died on the 27th of September 1954 at the age of 72. Also, on the 1st February 1943, the most obvious example of the so-called Peter Principle, named after the United States professor Lawrence C. Peter, can be seen in Ernst Busch, who was born in 1883 in Essenstiel and came from the infantry. In a hierarchy, every employee tends to rise to their level of incompetence. It was his unquestioning loyalty to Hitler that promoted Busch, shown in the picture on the right, to the highest command positions despite mediocre performance, even though his superiors wanted to replace him as early as 1942. But instead, Hitler's favorite had taken over Army Group Center, which had been virtually crushed by the Red Army in 1944 during Operation Bagration. This was mainly Bush's responsibility, in addition to the misinformation from the Counterintelligence Department, Foreign Armies East, and General Reinhard Gehlen. This defeat had been even greater than the catastrophe at Stalingrad. Out of 38 divisions deployed, 28 were destroyed. A total of 3 armies were wiped out, with losses of around 350,000 men. Although Bush was subsequently relieved and replaced by Field Marshal Model, he was then appointed commander of Army Group H, which was stationed in the Netherlands from March 1945, with which he went into British captivity. On the 17th of June 1945, Ernst Busch died at age 60 in British prisoner of war, Camp 1006 in Aldershot, reportedly a broken man. The second to last, appointed Field Marshal on March 1, 1944, was Walter Model, born in 1891 in Genthin, Prussian province of Saxony, and coming from the infantry. He was regarded, at the latest since the heavy defensive battles on the Eastern Front, as a master of defense. Model was close to National Socialism, conducted the Scorched Earth War in Russia, and was also responsible in his area of command for a number of war crimes committed by Einsatzgruppen. Model, who had apparently realized the futility of continuing the war relatively early, was one of the few who openly contradicted Hitler's conduct of the war, but nevertheless continued to carry out his orders. Here on the left, with Field Marshal von Rundstedt and General Krebs during the meeting about the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. When this operation failed in January 1945 and his already heavily demoralized Army Group B was encircled by Anglo-American forces in the so-called Ruhr Pocket in March, the 54-year-old Model shot himself near Duisburg on the 21st of April 1945. The last one on to be appointed Field Marshal was Ferdinand Schörner on 5th of April 1945, who was born in 1892 in Munich and came from the Bavarian infantry. He was a convinced National Socialist, had worn the Golden Party badge since 1943, and was considered Hitler's favorite general. In the Second World War, Schörner commanded several army groups one after another, and was notorious for his brutal enforcement of discipline and his almost slavish execution of Hitler's rigid defensive orders. While Schörner, also known as Bloody Ferdinand, had soldiers who were involuntarily separated from their units summarily sentenced to death. At the end of the war, he deserted his own troops in civilian clothes to avoid falling into Soviet captivity. After the war, he was initially in American captivity, then handed over to the Soviet Union, where he was sentenced to 25 years of forced labor. With one of the last transports, he returned to Germany in 1955 and, in 1957, was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison in Landsberg am Lech for manslaughter. At the same time, all pension rights were revoked. He was then released early from prison in August 1960 for health reasons. The last living former German field marshal of the army, and by far the most controversial one, passed away on the 2nd of July, 1973 in Munich at the age of 81. With that, my review of the 19 field marshals of the German army between 1936 and 1945 comes to an end. I have tried to classify them as briefly as possible. It was their fate to rise to the highest military positions in a time when more was demanded than just professional skill. If you had been a commander in the First World War, your actions and conduct would be judged differently. But as it is, you cannot separate them from what happened around them, for the events that, as the highest-ranking officers of the German army, they therefore had indirect responsibility for.